Good afternoon. Thank you all. I now ask Dr. George Lakeis to come up and introduce today's speaker, Dr. George Yancopoulos.
Good afternoon, everyone. So let's keep this wonderful conference going. And first of all, let me, of course, thank Your Eminence and Paulette and RJ, really, for all of the people that have put this together and have given their time and talent. We really do appreciate it. It's always a wonderful event. But my name is George Lakeis. I am from the the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, the Archdiocesan Cathedral of the Holy Trinity in New York. And I am proud to keep this going. Our next forum speaker is, there were two of them, and they are also your Leadership 100 Award for Excellence honorees. One of them couldn't be here, Dr. Christos Kyratzos, the Vice President of the Division of Regeneron in Infectious Disease and the Viral Vector Technologies. He couldn't be here, but we are still privileged and lucky to have, of course, his boss, Dr. George Yancopoulos, with us. My wife, Nicole, and I had the privilege of introducing Dr. Yancopoulos for the Chrysanthemum Ball in New York that took place in November. And most of you are not from New York, but that particular introduction was very special to me, and I wanted to sort of reiterate some of it. So for those of you who have been to the Chrysanthemum, I appreciate your patience. But for the rest of you, I did want to disclose some experiences that I've had that I think will be very important. But before doing that, let me just say, well, Dr. Yancopoulos represents Regeneron, and as most of you probably know, Regeneron Pharmaceuticals became quite popular when they treated President Trump when he had COVID. But for those of you who don't really stop to think about it, pharmaceutical companies like Regeneron and many others are much more than just a NASDAQ stock symbol, a distributor of drugs, a seller of drugs. You know, companies like Regeneron are really the groups that discover, that invent the technologies and the medicines and the procedures that keep us all alive and healthy. And I think many times we don't really stop to think about it when we ask, well, what is the NASDAQ symbol for Regeneron and what's their market cap? You know, we see these companies as companies, but we really don't stop to think, where would we be if they didn't exist? And I do think that that's very important. Regeneron in particular has so many products out there for autoimmune disorders, eye disorders, cancer, heart disease, and of course COVID. And if we didn't have the brains that are currently at Regeneron, including Dr. Yancopoulos, who knows where would we be? So I think in a room full of people that are proud people, I think it's so special that we are proud that one of these people, the Regeneron co-founder, is one of our own. And I think that's wonderful. I just wanted to start with that. I will allow Dr. Yancopoulos to tell more about himself and his upbringing and perhaps talk about COVID and Regeneron, the company. But I did want to also say that whenever I've been to places where somebody is being introduced, the thing that I always found special is when there was an anecdote or something that made it a little bit personal. My introduction to Dr. Yancopoulos, I was the president of the Hellenic Medical Society of New York, and about 6 or 7 years ago, we honored him as the Distinguished Hellene of the Year. Dr. Roy Vagelos, who most of you know, a tremendous individual, and his wife, he did the introduction for Dr. Yancopoulos. And Dr. Roy Vagelos, I will never forget, Dr. Roy Vagelos, in addition to talking about his experience with George, disclosed a small anecdote. George Yancopoulos was raised in New York, in Queens. He went to the very prestigious Bronx High School of Science and was valedictorian. As a valedictorian of Bronx High School of Science, of course, you can imagine he could have gone to any school, but he chose to go to Columbia. He then proceeded to get his MD, PhD from the Columbia University School of Medicine. But the story Dr. Vagelos said, and I still remember it well, and we said it at the Chrysanthemum Ball, was that he said that Columbia wanted him, they wanted to recruit him. They tried to recruit him so hard that they actually won him over. And when he graduated, Paracolo, as a valedictorian of Columbia University as well, one of the administrators said to his parents that we wanted him to come here because one day we know that he will win a Nobel Prize, and when he does, we want him to be able to say he's from Columbia. And it goes to show you, those administrators are Columbia smart. They're really smart. But I thought that story was so touching, and I remember it so many years later, I'm saying it as if I heard it myself, that I wanted to tell you guys about my story in an abridged version. And my story is that, can I have some water? My mouth is so dry. My story is that I'm a physician. My wife, Nicole, a strong part of this story. I'm a physician in New York City, and about 2 years ago, around this time, we were new members of Leadership 100 at the Breakers, meeting new friends like Brock and Christina Martin, and celebrating with probably most of you. Do you recall about 2 years ago, in a room much like this? About a month later, the world would never be the same, right? COVID came and took over, and the pandemic that we now know of as the COVID-19 pandemic took over the world. My job as a physician was to start testing people. That's how I saw it, and that's what we did. And March 25th, I ended up going to the hospital with very little notice, very few symptoms, and very quickly I was on an intubator and, of course, in a coma. That was about almost, this time 2 years ago. My wife couldn't get a hold of me, she couldn't see me, she couldn't come to the hospital, and she herself was also ill. But she had to become a COVID expert in very little time, and she did. During my trials and troubles in a coma, my wife had the good fortune of reaching out to Dr. Yancopoulos, whom she had not met at that point. And to make a long story short, she was desperate for assistance, she was desperate for guidance, and my statistical likelihood for survival was at that point dropping well below 15%. Dr. Yancopoulos gave hours upon hours of his time to my wife and the medical team. And it's not that he gave hours, it's that he showed a humane and human side of the story, of who he is. Something that if my wife didn't have, I don't know what she would have done. In addition, he was quite confident that my situation was very bad and expressed that to her. And although the staff at Cornell were hesitant, he made her insist that they take a much more aggressive stand. And to make a long story short, I became the first patient on a trial that had one of his drugs, and after being on the ventilator for approaching 2 weeks, I started to get better. So you can imagine my tie with Dr. Yancopoulos, and of course, the tie that I feel he has with my family. But that's not the reason that I tell you this story. You might say, okay, so what? Good for you, congratulations, he's a nice guy. That's not the reason I tell you the story. And the reason that I tell you the story is because these stories tell us something about a person that you may not know. And I want you to take this home, not only because he's one of us, but because you'll be hearing of him again over and over. That's what we expect from you. And of course, we look forward to your success. But when you hear about Regeneron Pharmaceuticals and Dr. George Yancopoulos, I want you to know this particular story. You see, when trouble finds you, we all pray to God for help, and we look to God for guidance, and we hope that God will carry us through the dark hours. But until trouble finds you, you don't know who will fight for you and who will stand by you or by your family. And then trouble finds you, and you know who that is going to be. What would you say to a person that might very well have been single-handedly responsible for your survival? What would you say to that person that stood by your family? What would you say to that person who basically was there not just for myself and my wife, but also my children and my mother? You see, when trouble finds you, we all reach to God and pray that God will help us. And God sometimes sends an angel. The angel that God sent to me was Dr. Yancopoulos. But that's not the reason that I tell you this story. You might say, good for you, so what? The reason I tell you this story and the reason it's relevant here today, and I'm so happy to be here with Dr. Yancopoulos and one of his children, is that what you will not learn from Dr. Yancopoulos is the kind of family man he is, the kind of person that he is, the devotion to science and innovation that he is. We all share a common language and culture. We all love our spanakopita and moussaka. But we're here together this weekend because we share a common strength of faith and a common love for our religion and Christianity and our dedication to its success. And the reason I tell you this story is because I went through a lot with COVID, and it's hard for us to even remember what life was like back then, just 2 years ago. But it took me about 6 months to even start walking without using a walker. And I took a long time just to breathe. It's still not my normal voice, whatever. And my wife told me the story of how things transpired with my care. And in my, if you can imagine, whispering of a voice and my weakened state, I felt I needed to call Dr. Yancopoulos and thank him for everything he did. And so there I was recovering, not being able to walk, not being able to speak. And Dr. Yancopoulos, the co-founder and president and chief scientific officer at Regeneron, one of the most influential scientists of the world today, I called him and he answered the phone, and I told him, I think I need to thank you. I understand that you saved my life. And he could have turned around and said, yes, our company has a great drug. He could have turned around and said, yes, you owe me one. He could have turned around and said, very simply, you're welcome. But this man, your Leadership 100 Award for Excellence honoree, said to me, I didn't save your life, God did. So Dr. Yancopoulos, come on up here and tell these lovely people more about yourself and about Regeneron. And he knows my special bond with him.
George just whispered in my ear, imagine if I had died, who'd be giving you this introduction? You know, I'm sure many of you know George, but for those who don't know, George himself has been a savior and angel to thousands over the years. He's a physician, he's dedicated his life. I can't tell you how many people that he has done more for them than you can imagine. And I think the other thing that I told him was, it was not only God, it was his wife, who really I mean, for those of you who know, unfortunately, how hard it is to the healthcare system, hospitals, they're so overworked. That if you don't have an advocate, if you don't have somebody who's fighting for you 24/7, you're in trouble. And so really, Nicole's the one who really did everything to save his life. I also want to acknowledge and thank Your Eminence, Paulette, who does everything, as far as I can tell around here. RJ, who's who we share not only our common Greek roots, but we're fellow Castorians and Macedonians, the real Macedonians. And I was also honored enough to meet your next president, Dimitrios Panagos. So thank you all. I want to start by saying I'm really sorry that you guys are not getting an opportunity to meet the true, real superstar and the guy who's going to really change the world going forward, Christos Kyriatsous, who's an amazing scientist. He is personally responsible for coming up with first the first FDA-approved cure and treatment for Ebola. And then the same, and then if that wasn't enough, the same guy came up with the first monoclonal antibody treatment for COVID-19. He is an incredible scientist, also an incredible person, human being. He happens to be from Kozani, which is right next to Kastoria, for those of you who don't know. And I don't know, there's something special about the water up there, I think. I think there's one thing, I mean, George obviously said a lot of things, but there's one thing that I want to focus on, which he said, which is absolutely true, when he said that George is one of us. And I couldn't be prouder. I couldn't be prouder to be one of you. I couldn't be prouder of our origins and our heritage and our religion. I think everybody should be proud of where they came from and who they are. But I do think we have something special to look back on and reflect on. And I think in many ways who we are explains why so many Greeks, including so many of you in this room, have contributed so much to the world, starting thousands and thousands of years ago to today, to people like Christos Kyriatsous and so many other amazing Greeks. So I want to start with that in terms of I think one of the things that makes us special is our faith and our beliefs. And I do think that we have a very special and unique faith, religion, but also leadership. I mean, right here with the Archbishop, but also I was lucky enough for the first time, like several of you, I'm sure, to meet the Patriarch. And I think so many of us, we should be so proud, and we couldn't be prouder of the leadership that we have. While so many others and so many other religions in the world, for some reason, have a hard time reconciling science and God, we don't have that problem. We recognize God made science as a weapon and a tool for us to use. And as you all know, the Patriarch has been at the forefront of arguing for sustaining our environment and for taking the right approaches to disease, including vaccination and so forth. And I think it's so important, and it just shows, probably, because of our roots. I mean, yeah, God created science, but the Greeks, he brought it to humanity. So what's more appropriate than our religious leaders making us stay strong and firm to that? I also think that another thing that I value so much about our religion and what you guys support is our priesthood and the people who take care of us in our churches. Once again, I don't know, it doesn't seem like an accident that the Greek Orthodox faith has gotten it right. I do not believe that you can be the father of a community and lead the community if you're not really understanding who we all are and how we live our lives. I think we've had incredible priests throughout my whole life. I started in the Bronx at what was then Holy Trinity, which actually moved to New Rochelle, unbelievable enough, which is now the church that I'm at. But, you know, all over the city, from St. D's to Transfiguration in Corona, through the Bronx, and now up at Holy Trinity, the leaders of our community, our priests, were some of the most remarkable human beings that I ever knew. For those of you who just know, our current priest at Holy Trinity in New Rochelle, Father Nick, one of the greatest human beings on the planet. Before him, Father Peter Kyriakos. RJ and I are best friends with his son, Steve Kyriakos, one of the greatest families around. He's Steve's godfather to my older son, who's not here. My younger son is here. And the thing that makes these people so special, I believe, is the openness that our religion has to encouraging them to being married, having their own families, understanding what our lives are like so that they can actually help be fathers, real fathers to the community, because they're also fathers in their own world. And so, once again, from understanding the importance and the responsibility that we have to our world in terms of saving the environment, to the importance it is to train our religious leaders in our communities to actually be part of the communities and to be, you know, husbands and fathers themselves, you know, we get it right. And I think that obviously what you guys all do, supporting and trying to make sure that this not only continues but continues to get stronger, there's nothing more important, I don't think. And I think that it's these sorts of things that we all share, our heritage, our faith, our language, that make us all who we are. Anybody who knows me, whether it's George or whether it's my son Luca, knows that everything about me is entirely and totally shaped by my own upbringing and my heritage within the Greek way of life. You know, in case some of you might have heard this at the Chrysanthemum event, I am going to, and Paulette encouraged me to, so you have her to blame if you heard some of this before, but I talked about how important, how meaningful my parents, my grandparents, my yayadas and papudas, you know, were in my life, my upbringing, and making me who I am. I'd be nothing without them. And I pointed to, sorry, Paulette, you're to blame for this. The single most meaningful moment in my life, which I will never forget, and I passed it on to my kids. When I was a kid, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10, like many of you, I was born here. My parents came here just before I was born. You all know there was a civil war in Greece. Northern Greece particularly suffered a lot. My father was both in World War II and in the Civil War against the communists, and they came here with nothing. My parents didn't finish their education, but they believed so much in America, but they also believed so much in Greece. And I'm sure, like many of you, even though they had no money, I don't know how they did this, they would try to work real hard to take us back to our patrida. And we would go to Castoria and visit all the relatives. And the most meaningful moment of my life occurred in the hills around Castoria. We would go, my father was a very active guy, and he would take us hiking through the hills. And these are happy memories, by the way. And we're walking through the hills and we stop. And of course, I'm sure like many of you, I was raised on the stories of our history. I was raised on the stories of how my grandfather was a freedom fighter. Northern Greece was still under the Turks. So many of those people of our generation that my grandparents told me about were lost in those times. My grandfather himself, as a freedom fighter, was captured and sentenced to death, a whole long story. But the stories went on and on. I was raised on, like you were, on the lullabies of Fengaraki Moulambro, which is all about, think about it, it's all about how we retained over 400 to 500 years of enslavement, oppression, and subjugation. We retained our language and our religion. I mean, how unique is that in the history of mankind? I was raised on the songs, not only the lullabies. I don't know how many of you remember the song Mavrini Nichta Stavuna. Okay, I sang that to my boys when I was growing up, and I told them the stories. So, my father, of course, didn't stop with the recent history. He told me about how I was connected to the past. He told me about all the great Greeks who brought the world, science, geometry, philosophy, democracy. Essentially, everything that we are now comes from those times. I mean, it's unbelievable to me. I sort of a little bit of a math nerd growing up, and probably still am. But what I was amazed at was not only did the ancient Greeks know that the world was a globe, they actually had calculated its circumference as accurately as we can measure it today. And perhaps most importantly, because we were the real Macedonians, my father told me, true story, and I've told my son this, that we are direct lineal descendants of Alexander the Great. Now, honestly, it doesn't matter if it's true. The only thing that matters is that you believe it. Because if you believe that greatness is in your genes, then you have a much greater chance of achieving greatness. And I think this is what we all as Greeks believe. We come from an incredible history of greatness, and that greatness is inside all of us. And this brings me back to this magic, most meaningful moment of my life when I was on those hills as an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old boy with my father trying to keep up. And he stopped, and we were looking on the mountains. And probably the night before, he had sang the song Mavrini Nichta Stavuna to me. And we paused, and he goes, George, or actually Yorgo, goes, never forget the blood that was spilled on these mountains just so you could be here today. And he said, you have to repay that debt by making sure that you do something for the world. I think all of us Greeks We have inside of us that heritage, that legacy, but we also bear that responsibility. And I think that's in part why so many of us, so many of you in this room have achieved greatness, have contributed, have done amazing things for the world. It's because of we didn't just spontaneously become who we are. We are who we are because of where we came from. Now, I think that I have a whole presentation, which I'm probably not going to give on the story of our company and so forth. But I do think that our company, in a way, is sort of a microcosm, another Greek word, of the world, and representative of the contributions that our people have made and continue to make. George mentioned the great Roy Vagelos. Roy Vagelos is the founding chairman of Regeneron. He is, other than my father, probably my most important mentor, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, but we pass it on. Our greatest scientists and leaders, not only originally people like Roy, and I'll put myself in that category, but our more recent young leadership. I do have a picture of these guys, so let's see if I can pull that up. These are two of our most important senior vice presidents. On the right is Christos Kyratsous. He's the one who should be up here talking to you, my fellow Macedonian. On the left, another incredible Greek, Aris Baris. These guys are literally changing the world. They are changing the technology of science. They're changing, they're creating the new biotechnology. We have Rich Neal in the back of the room, okay? The next generation after these guys, he's at Regeneron, he's a budding scientist, he's right there. Stand up, Rich. And I'm counting on him when he's these guys' age to be changing the world as well. And why? Why is it that Greeks throughout the world, throughout all industries, and in biotechnology are such drivers? It's because of the reasons that I already told you, and we recognize it. And in my particular case, I'm going to tell you, I've got a million stories, but I'll tell you another story, since George brought up Roy Vagelos. This is also some place where my two mentors, my father and Roy Vagelos, came together. So when I was growing up, I was a math whiz, I was good at sciences, and my parents, without education, they didn't know that much. And like many immigrants to this day, when you're good at the sciences and at math, you're encouraged to become a physician or a real doctor, as my father said. So he wanted me, because, you know, that's what he knew was a very respectable, honored career where you could really make a difference, which is very true, obviously. But he pushed me, and I pushed myself so hard that the more I got into studying hard and doing the science, I fell more and more in love with the science. And I decided that maybe instead of being a real doctor, I would become a PhD doctor, which he discounted, and actually do science. And I came home, I was in high school, at the Bronx High School of Science, to announce to my father that I had decided that I really wanted to become a scientist instead of a real doctor. And he was initially, you know, devastated. He was very upset. For one reason, one of the reasons was even he knew back then, and it's still true to a degree, that not only do you do a lot of good by being a doctor, but it's a more respected profession, and you also tend to make more money than the fake PhD doctors. So he was that was one of his concerns, obviously coming from, poor roots and so forth, that maybe I wouldn't be able to, make enough money to support myself. But as I said, he was devastated for a while, and then the next day. So I'm sure many of you guys have grown up the same way and lived this. I mean, my father never really totally assimilated. All his friends were Greek. He was in the, Omonia Castoria Club. That was who he hung out with. He would be in the taverna in his free time in a story and so forth. He never really adopted the English language, even though he was very proud, like I'm sure we all are. He was the proudest American. He gave America credit for saving the world. He thinks this is the greatest country in the country of opportunity, which is why he said he brought us to this country, because we could do whatever we strove to do here. But as I said, he didn't assimilate, and so even when I was in my 20s and he had been here for 20 plus years, he still didn't read the American newspapers. He read the Ethnikos Kyrikas. And the day after I tell my father that I was giving up his dream of becoming a real doctor to become a scientist instead, he comes to me with an article. This is 1975, Ethnikos Kyrikas. And he says to me, well, if you're going to become a scientist, don't become like just any scientist, at least. Become like this scientist. And it was an article in the Ethnikos Kyrikas about Roy Vagelos leaving academia to become head of R&D, research and development, at Merck Pharmaceuticals, where he would then go on and change the world, change the whole business of pharmaceutical sciences. And in the Ethnikos Kyrikas, he was regularly featured, because how many of you in this room are on statins? Roy discovered statins. Back then, he came up with some of the first vaccines, vaccines for HPV and so forth. He cured African river blindness. So there was story after story, and my father cut out every single article. I have a portfolio at home. And George, I don't know if you know the story. I was grown up. I was a little shy kid, and maybe some of you were like this. So my father says to me, George, or Yorgo, the great Roy Vagelos is being honored by the Hellenic Medical Society. I was probably just in either college or beginning of my graduate studies. He goes, I have a doctor friend, Dr. Kotsilimbas. I don't know how many of you may have known him. And he can get us in to go to the event. I want you to meet your role model, the great Roy Vagelos. You know what I said? I said, Papa, this is going to be so embarrassing. I'm not going to go. But my father made me go, and I shook the great man's hand, and through a whole series of events, maybe I'll tell you that story too, he eventually became chairman of our company and my mentor. All right, I'll tell you that story. So, flash forward, I'll just show you the slides to show you the pictures. This is my good friend, probably best friend in the world, and longtime partner, Len Schleifer. I hope you guys can tell who I am in the picture. I like showing these pictures because I think they really capture and exemplify the fact of which partner has been carrying which partner on his back over the last 30 years. No, that's a joke. I mean, Len is the greatest in the world, and I owe him everything, and we could not have done anything. I could not have done anything without him. But anyway, when we started the company, my father was still on this Roy Vagelos kick. Of course, Roy was everybody's hero. He was my hero, he was my father's hero. But my father, was a great guy, and in the early days of starting Regeneron, I mean, he was older and retired. I think he visited some of you guys in, the various, he would always go to the Greek radio station and the Greek newspaper. He was always at the Omonia. He was, he would go visit a bunch of people, but he would go visit us in the early days of Regeneron. And we struggled for a long time. In the first couple of years at Regeneron, we were really struggling. And he was always saying, he would come in, and he became eventually very good friends with Len as well, and he would say, in his broken Greek, in his broken English, he would sort of get across the point that we were two knuckleheads that didn't really know what we were doing. And he kept saying to us, what you guys got to do is you guys got to call Roy Vagelos. Because he would be interested in helping a young Greek kid succeed, and he'll get you guys on the right path, because you guys don't know what you're doing. And I would go, Papa. And Len would joke. Len would, I still remember to this day, because most of the time we'd be all hanging together. I mean, we were a very small company. We fit in a quarter of this room probably. And we were all sitting together, usually in Len's office when he would come and visit us. And Len would joke, Mr. Yancopoulos, if you say that again, I'm going to have to call security and have you escorted off our premises. First of all, we didn't have security, but he was just joking. So this went on for a couple of years. And then one day, in one of our most dismal moments, when our stock was down to less than $1 a share, we were running out of money and all sorts of problems and so forth, I'm sitting by myself. No, my father's not there, sitting in Len's office. And Len goes, George, I know both of us, we've been trying to model this company after what the great Roy Vagelos did. But I'm beginning to think that maybe we could use some help doing this. Because I'm thinking of, calling Roy Vagelos and seeing he'd be interested to come help us. And I remember saying, Len, you're sounding like my crazy old dad. Have you lost your mind? And for the oldsters in this room, he literally picks up the phone. This is a landline. There's no cell phones. There's no internet. There's no Google. And for those of you who don't remember, he dials like information. And he goes, could I please have information for Rahway, New Jersey? And he gets somehow the number for at the time, Roy had progressed from head of R&D to CEO. He gets the office of the CEO of Merck. And luckily, from my perspective, he doesn't get through, and he just leaves a message. And I said, boy, Len, this is like really embarrassing. I mean, this is, we're never going to hear back from Roy or whatever. A couple days later, Len comes running up to me in the hallways, and he starts shaking. He goes, Roy called back. Roy called back. He wants to meet you. Because I was a young Greek guy. And it turns out he wanted to help us out, and sort of the rest became history. But it's, one story after another where I have to say either I can point to my family, my heritage, my faith that made, me who I am, made all of you who all you guys are, Leadership 100, and how somehow we seem to all connect to each other. How is it possible that, the great Roy Vagelos became my mentor? How is it possible that I now have some, not only these two guys, but these two guys are, two of our current leaders who literally are changing and saving the world. And the next generation guys like Rich Neal. How is this all possible? Because it's in our genes, it's in our spirit, it's in our soul, and it's our responsibility. I know you all feel it, we all share it. I am so proud to be one of you, and I also am so proud of all the work that you guys are doing, because it's so important. So thank you.